was nominated, he was the only Republican nominated, running against 3 Democrats. Lincoln only got 40% of the vote. I don't expect you to remember that. But Lincoln only got 40% of the vote, but he got an electoral landslide. Again, if you know the way our Constitution works, when a candidate gets the most votes, every elector goes from that state goes to that candidate. So if Lincoln got 40% of one state, and the other candidates split up the other 60% among them, 20, 40, 20% apiece, Lincoln would get all the electors from that state, with only a minority of the votes. Again, do you understand? Because the Electoral College has come under fire, particularly, and this is not the first time in the election we held in 2016. Hillary Clinton got the majority of the popular vote, more votes than Donald Trump. But Donald Trump won the Electoral College, so Donald Trump became president, which is according to the Constitution as it is written. There have been other times. Woodrow Wilson, with only about 40% of the popular vote, got to be president because the Republicans split their vote.
Al Gore.
Al Gore, because Republicans split their vote, a lot of Republicans voted for Ross Perot. And Ross Perot split the Republican vote, and not Al Gore, but Bill Clinton became president. Now Al Gore, that was a disputed election in 2000. The Supreme Court finally ruled in favor of all people, George Bush. Something else about the election of 2000, if convicted criminals were been allowed to vote, Al Gore would have won. That's in your book, folk. The people who had been convicted, most of them for drug offenses, marijuana in particular, if they had been allowed to vote, Al Gore would have won the election, but they can't vote. All right. Now, Abe Lincoln did not campaign. I repeat, did not. He sat in his home and waited. And now, keep in mind that by this time the railroad had been invented. It was 1860. The telegraph had been invented. Nevertheless, communications were not as fast as they are today. Telegraph was expensive, and they were used very sparingly. Nevertheless, the South Carolina delegation told the country, if Lincoln is elected, we will leave the Union. Other southern states followed. Now, folk, I've only seen this documented one time, and if any of you know anything more about it, I did not grow up in Georgia. Maybe you can tell it. But in Stone Mountain Park here, they say that when Georgia people voted, they voted 52 to 48 to stay in the Union. But the legislature overruled the vote and said, we're going to leave anyway. If any of you know anything more about that, your input is welcome. But Georgia was one of the states that threatened to leave if Lincoln were elected. Well, Lincoln was elected, but he did not, nobody knew he was elected on the election night. The returns were slow at being counted and slow at coming in. Not every precinct had a telegraph machine right there. But slowly the votes came in. By December it was clear that Lincoln had won the election. South Carolina, though, was a little bit hesitant. We started telegraphing the other states, where will you leave the Union also if we leave? They got assurances that they would. So South Carolina leading the way, they began leaving the Union. Your book calls it secession winter. They argued, the Southerners argued among themselves. South Carolina got out, like I said, got out first. The other states were a little bit slow in following, but before the inauguration, 7 states had left the Union. Now your book mentions that Abe Lincoln came in by night. Abe Lincoln was sneaked into Washington. Oh yes, I'll tell this. You'll see pictures of Lincoln as being president-elect without a beard. But I've mentioned how Abraham Lincoln was somewhat of an unattractive man. And one 12-year-old girl wrote a letter, Mr. President, you ought to grow a beard. So when Lincoln was on his way to Washington, he passed through the town in New York where he knew this girl was living. He asked out loud, is such and such a girl, young girl, in the audience? And everybody started pointing a finger. Yeah, she's right here. He said, bring her forward. And he said, I've started taking your advice. He started growing his beard, which he's famous for. But actually, he did not grow a beard until after he was elected. And then as president, he was elected except for Andrew Johnson, for the next 35 years, every one of our presidents had whiskers. Until McKinley refused to grow a beard. And so to balance the ticket, they put on Theodore Roosevelt, who had a mustache. A little bit of a joke there, but anyway. But for the next several years, all of our presidents had beards. Beards became in style back then. But anyway, Lincoln grew a beard while he was on his way to the White House. But while he was on his way there, 7 states had left the Union. Lincoln had to be sneaked into Washington and sneaked into the White House. And this takes us up to, well, just one more thing in this chapter. A lot of people doubted that Lincoln could lead the Union in this crisis. Lincoln made an inaugural address and he said to the Southern people, we are not enemies but friends. We must not be enemies. And he said, into your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, lies the future of this nation. Takes us up now to chapter 15. Takes us up, start the opening vignette is about another Douglas, not Frederick Douglass. No, it's not Stephen Douglas. This was a runaway slave who decided to devote his entire life to freeing other slaves. And for 20 years he went around the country making speeches, and at times it seemed to him like his work was for nothing. When the Republicans won the election of 1860, he was happy about it, but he realized that the Republican Party not only had to be dedicated to prevent slavery, but to eradicate it. Now, Abraham Lincoln ran on a ticket that he promised the Southern people, and again, folks, you have to understand, this was the best he could do. He promised the Southern people that if elected, I will not do anything to do away with slavery where it already exists. I will let it alone where it exists, but I will not allow slavery to expand any farther. That was his promise. His name was not even on the ballot in most southern states. So he won without carrying a southern state. Again, the northern states had the most people. Well, more than other people, Douglas realized that the Civil War was about slavery. Now, of the states that left the Union, let's see. 8 states left when Lincoln made his inaugural address. Your book names them. Abraham Lincoln had no plan to keep the Union together except to just simply sit down, keep cool, and hope that tempers would cool, and somehow keep the upper states in the Union. Now, your book divides the states in the upper and lower southern. The lower southern states, of course, being Georgia and South Carolina and Florida and Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana and Texas. They were the lower states. The upper states were North Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, and Arkansas. I want to say this. 4 of these states stayed in the Union. Delaware and Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri were 4 slave states that never left the Union. In the case of Maryland, they were held in, you might say, by bayonets. Abraham Lincoln would not let them leave. And in the case of Virginia, an interesting thing happened. 13 counties in the mountains of Virginia refused to leave the Union, and they went off and formed their own state. And in 1862, they were admitted into the Union. It's called the state of West Virginia. Yeah, West Virginia broke away from Virginia and formed its own state, and they remain separate from the state of Virginia to this day. Now, here is the issue. These new states, these states that left the Union formed their own country, and they called themselves the Confederate States of America. In the meantime, they took over all, yes?
I don't understand what does the Confederate flag mean?
Oh, the Confederate flag it has the stars for the 11 states that left the Union with 1 star in the center, and the others, it basically is it was somewhat of a copy of the Union flag. It was a copy, but with some differences, separated from the flag of the United States.
Was one of the differences is they wanted slavery or what?
The big difference between the Confederate States and the Union was slavery. There were other differences. The Confederate States formed their own constitution where they said that the president can only serve one term of 6 years. They also said the Supreme Court did not have the power to nullify laws passed by the Congress. There were some differences, but they copied the federal constitution with a few differences, and it specified clearly that slavery was to be the law of the land permanently. But the number one issue, again, was slavery. Now, the Confederate States immediately captured all the arsenals. There were some 26 arsenals that had belonged to the federal government, which the Confederates took over, but 2 of them did not surrender. One in Pensacola, Florida, and the other in Fort Sumter, South Carolina. James Buchanan, president at that time, turned over the issue to Abraham Lincoln, said, "You handle it." Lincoln had to decide, now, was he going to let Fort Sumter fall, or was he at least going to send food and supplies? So Lincoln finally sent a ship to Fort Sumter that had nothing but food and medical supplies, no armaments, because he was not going to let troops who were still loyal to him starve. I mean, it's just something the Army does not do. The vice president was the Georgia governor, the vice president of the Confederacy, urged Mr. Davis, President Jefferson Davis became president of the Confederacy. Davis said, "They are taking our guns and our stuff that belongs to us and holding on to them, and he is supporting men who belong to us." This was that, and therefore we're going to fire on them. So on Mr. Davis's orders, when he learned that Lincoln had sent a ship to resupply food and medicine to the men at Fort Sumter, Jefferson Davis ordered that Fort Sumter be fired upon. The firing lasted all night long. In the morning, Major Anderson, in charge of the fort, himself a Southerner, surrendered. This was the beginning of the Civil War. Fort Sumter, not one human life was lost, 1 horse was killed. This was not a foretelling of what was to come. This turned out to be the biggest mistake that President Jefferson Davis made, because all of a sudden all the North rose up united as one man and said, "They have fired on our men. They have fired on our troops loyal to us." Abraham Lincoln called for volunteers, and he sent an army from Washington to relieve the troops at Fort Sumter, but the army had to pass through Virginia. Now, in the meantime, Robert Edward Lee could not decide which side he was on. But then he said, "Oh, well, any nation..." Well, no, he became upset. He said, "The federal government has sent foreign troops into the state of Virginia without the state of Virginia's permission. Therefore, I'm going to side with my home state." He also said that any nation that could not hold itself together was not a nation that he'd support. So he joined with forces and left the Union and became a general in the Confederate Army. In the meantime, while he was doing this, his own state split in 2. As I've already mentioned, the state of Virginia split in 2. And Lee said, "No, they have no right to leave," and Lee led an army into West Virginia. And Lee's army was defeated in West Virginia. And the first year of the war went badly for Lee. He lost part of his own state. All right. But anyway, it was okay for Virginia to leave the Union, but it was not okay for West Virginia to leave the state of Virginia. If you think that's inconsistent, this was a lot of what was going on with the Southern thinking at the time. Now, it's a good thing, folks, that Kentucky stayed with the Union. If you know anything about the geography of that region, if you ever visit Cincinnati, the land on the north side of the Ohio River, there's this flat land. And the land on the Kentucky side is a hill going straight up. And that would have been really, really hard for the Union Army to cross that wide river without exposing themselves. I mean, the Ohio River is wide. It had been hard for them to cross that river and while the enemy was shooting at them from high above and down below. As it was, Kentucky stayed with the Union. Kentucky, yeah, it was a slave state. We didn't have very many slaves. Kentucky stayed. Missouri, there was a whole lot of German immigrants who had moved into Missouri. They voted for Missouri to stay in. Missouri stayed in, also itself a slave state. Delaware stayed. Maryland was about to leave, but Abraham Lincoln suspended the Constitution and forced Maryland to stay in. If Maryland left the Union, the city of Washington would have been located smack in Confederate territory, pure and simple. And the Confederates were to try to get Maryland in later. They never could. All right. In the state of Missouri, an interesting thing occurred. They stayed in the Union, but a bunch of the people were Confederate, and bands of guerrillas would go around sniping at people loyal to the Union. And two of the men who were doing this were two brothers named Jesse James and his brother Robert. Some of you might know Jesse James became an outlaw after the war. But Jesse and Robert were both Confederate soldiers initially. And they continued long after the war. Jesse was finally shot dead. His brother Robert turned himself in, was acquitted, and lived the rest of his life a free man. All right, who was who and what was what? All right, the combatants. The South said the North would started the war. The North said the South were traitors. The biggest advantage the North had, well, they had two. Number one, they had by far the most money and the most resources.
More people.
Most people, especially the most people. Now, in Texas, there was a northern governor named Sam Houston. And Sam Houston resigned as governor because he did not want Texas to leave the Union, but Texas left anyway. But as Sam Houston was resigning, he told the people of the South, he said, "You are better soldiers than they are, and you'll initially beat them. But what you don't know about them is they have a streak of stubbornness about them. They won't quit fighting, and they will keep coming back, and they will win because they will wear you down because they outnumber you." Sam Houston died in 1863 without seeing the North and South united again. But he's partly remembered for his prophetic words that turned out to be so true later. All right. President Davis started off with his capital in Montgomery, Alabama, but in order to direct the operations to fight better, he moved his capital to Richmond. So Washington and Richmond are only about 100 miles apart. Washington, D.C. and Richmond. And most of the battles of the Civil War that were important occurred between Washington and Richmond. However, not all of them. Now, there was some fighting going on in the West, and there was a battle that occurred here in Atlanta, Georgia. There was another battle that occurred at Kennesaw, and another battle occurred close to where I live that is largely forgotten about. But most of the fighting, though, occurred between Richmond and Washington. And most of the fighting initially went all in favor of the Confederacy. The Union Army was led by a man named George McClellan. A good man in a lot of ways, but a man who simply would not move. McClellan sat in the office and complained that I don't have enough men, I don't have enough equipment, and I'm not going to move. And he blamed Lincoln. All right, your book will say McClellan called Lincoln an idiot, and he called Lincoln's cabinet a flock of geese. You know, the geese are known for their lack of intelligence. But here's what, there's a saying, twinkle, 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 little star, what you say is what you are. Today's historians think of McClellan as being the idiot. Here's what happened to McClellan. He had some men watching the Confederacy, and the Confederates knew they were being watched, so the Confederate soldiers all marched single file in plain view of the men who were counting them. But then after they marched, they'd go around where they couldn't be seen, change outfits if they could, regroup, and march again. They all marched 3 times, and were all counted 3 times, and reported back to General McClellan the Confederate army was 3 times larger than it actually was. McClellan believed himself to be hopelessly outnumbered. Also, the Confederacy chopped down some trees and pointed these trees toward the Union, and it looked like heavy artillery. And McClellan believed that the Confederacy had far more heavy artillery than they actually had, far more cannon. And to this day, if you go to certain places in Virginia, you'll see these same, maybe they've replaced a tree, but you'll see these trees have been chopped down and pointed in the direction of Washington as a, you might say, as a tribute to the Confederacy's ingenuity and to McClellan's sheer stupidity. Now, when the war was over and McClellan realized that he'd been duped, he took his family and went off to Europe for 10 years, hoping that by that time the people would forget. To this day, we haven't forgotten. Essentially, McClellan, he did one thing right now. He saw that the Union Army was badly disorganized, and he organized them. If McClellan would have been number 2 in command and had one officer higher than him, but that was not the case. McClellan was placed in charge, and he would not move. And during the time he was sitting still, the Confederacy was building up. We now know if he'd have moved right away, the war could have ended rather quickly. As it was, he delayed. When he finally engaged, it was a big defeat for the Union side. The Confederates won. There were several things, again, that went the Confederates' way. Number one, they had better leaders, better generals. But there was another problem, though, with the Confederate generals. Now, the number 1 general was Robert E. Lee. And, of course, Stonewall Jackson is favored, and Jeb Stuart. These generals won battle after battle. And if you go to Stone Mountain, you'll see a statue of Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall Jackson lags behind the other two because he and Jefferson Davis did not like each other. Stonewall Jackson did not like anyone, hardly. But anyway, that's another issue. But here's what we now think of the Confederate generals. I mean, Robert E. Lee's name gets lower and lower as time goes on because the Confederate generals fought as though they had as many men as the Union. They fought in such a way that they eventually wore down their numbers. Now, if you look at the figure, typical battle, Union engaged Confederacy. The Union lost far more men than Confederacy. But the percentage, the Confederacy lost a higher percentage at the same battle than Union did. But here's the catch-22. The Union was able to replace its losses. Eventually, the Confederacy couldn't. All right, folks, be back in about 10 minutes.